The girl was crying beside the old oak tree, small hands moving frantically, tears falling, but no voice reached her own silent world. People at the garden party stared with confusion, wondering why a billionaire's daughter looked so terrified on such a perfect afternoon. Her father stood a few steps away, tailored suit, distracted eyes, but still not understanding what his child needed. Since birth, Erica could not hear, and words always came late between them. Love trapped behind quiet walls. Gary D. Baker tried everything money could buy. Specialists, devices, therapy sessions. Yet something inside his daughter stayed distant. Today was supposed to be simple, just a corporate event where he could show her off to his colleagues, proof he could balance empire and family. A father trying again to feel successful. But Erica's cries grew stronger, face red, fingers gripping the tree bark like she was warning about something. Gary knelt briefly, asking softly, but the child only shook her head, fear clear in eyes too young for such worry. Around them, strangers whispered, thinking it was just another spoiled, rich child throwing tears for attention again. No one saw the panic hidden in those small hands, or the message she could not send through broken sound. A few steps away stood a quiet homeless boy, watching closely, eyes sharp, like he understood more than anyone there, and in the next moment he would reveal a truth that would change how this father saw his daughter forever. The homeless boy stepped forward slowly, not afraid like the others, his eyes fixed on Erica's trembling hands. He didn't look at Gary first, only at the child, as if her fear was louder to him than any spoken word. Gently, Oscar touched the tree bark where her fingers pointed, then suddenly pulled his hand back in alarm. A thin crack ran through the massive branch, deep and fresh, the heavy limb above them hanging by fragile wood fibers. The wind moved softly through riverside gardens, but it was enough, and the branch gave a quiet shift that most people failed to notice. Oscar waved his arms urgently, shouting for everyone to move, his voice sharp enough to cut through champagne conversations. Gary looked up at last, heart dropping, as he saw the danger his daughter had been trying to show all along. In one fast motion, he grabbed Erica and stumbled backward just as the branch crashed down where they had stood. Dust and leaves burst into the air. People screaming now, shock spreading through the elegant crowd like sudden fire. Erica clung to her father tightly, small chest shaking, eyes wide, but filled with relief instead of fear. Gary's hands trembled as he held her, realizing his daughter had seen what he himself had completely missed, and for the first time he understood that silence had never meant weakness, only a different way of seeing. The crowd slowly gathered around, whispers rising, everyone staring at the fallen branch that could have ended multiple lives. Gary knelt down, still holding Erica, eyes wet, guilt and gratitude mixing in a storm inside his chest. He kept replaying the moment, how he almost ignored the warning again, how close he came to losing everything that truly mattered. Oscar stood nearby, quiet now, watching Erica as if making sure she was truly safe this time. Their eyes met for a second, and something passed between them. A silent understanding no one else could read. A business associate rushed over, breathless, asking what happened, but Gary could barely find his voice to answer. He looked at his daughter, really looked, seeing not a problem to fix, but a world he had never tried to enter. Tears slid down without shame, because fear had washed away the pride he once wore like expensive armor. He whispered, "I'm sorry, not for the branch but for all the times he failed to understand his child." Erica didn't speak, but she leaned forward, resting her forehead against her father's shoulder in quiet comfort. Around them, noise returned to the shattered garden party, but in that moment, Gary D. Baker finally understood what real wealth looked like. It wasn't measured in stock portfolios or corporate deals. It was measured in the language he'd been too proud to learn, the world he'd been too busy to enter, and the homeless boy who saw his daughter's truth when he could not. Gary D. Baker's morning began the way it always did, with 3 phones buzzing before sunrise and coffee delivered by staff he barely acknowledged. He stood in his penthouse office, 30 floors above the city, watching the skyline wake up beneath him like a kingdom waiting for orders. Another day. Another deal. Another number climbing higher on screens that never stopped moving. Downstairs, in a bedroom larger than most family homes, Erica sat cross-legged on imported Italian marble, surrounded by toys that cost more than college tuition. A French tutor waited by the window, checking her watch. A speech therapist organized flashcards on the dresser. A nanny scrolled through her phone near the door. All of them paid generously to fill the space where a father should be. Erica's hands moved through the air, forming words no one in the room could read. The tutor smiled politely, not understanding. The therapist pointed at her lips, mouthing sounds the girl would never hear. The nanny glanced up briefly, then returned to her screen. 3 adults in one room, and the child remained completely alone. Gary told himself he was building something for her. Every contract signed, every company acquired, every hostile takeover successfully executed, it was all for Erica's future. He'd set up trust funds that would sustain her for generations. He'd hired the best specialists in 3 countries. He'd bought her hearing aids so advanced they cost more than luxury cars. He was giving her everything. Everything except himself. He'd attended exactly 2 of her therapy sessions in the past year. Both times, he'd stayed less than 20 minutes before an urgent call pulled him away. Both times, he'd promised to do better next week. Both times, the next week never came. The mansion echoed with expensive silence. 16 rooms, most of them empty. Art on the walls worth millions, chosen by decorators Gary never met. A kitchen designed for elaborate meals, used mainly by staff who ate alone. Erica's footsteps made small sounds against marble floors, wandering from room to room, looking for something she couldn't name. Her bedroom held every toy a child could want. Dolls from Paris. Building sets from Germany. Electronic tablets preloaded with educational games designed specifically for deaf children. She touched none of them. Instead, she sat by the window, watching other children play in the park across the street, their laughter silent to her but somehow still felt. Gary walked past her door that evening, glancing in briefly. She didn't look up. He paused, thinking he should enter, thinking he should sit with her, thinking he should try. But his phone buzzed again, and the moment passed like smoke. He had a conference call with Tokyo in 10 minutes. He'd spend time with her this weekend. He promised himself. The same promise he'd made last weekend. And the weekend before that. The quiet walls grew higher with every gift he sent instead of himself, every tutor hired instead of learning alongside her, every check written instead of time given. Gary believed he was building her a castle. He never realized he was building her a prison, and the only key she wanted was the one thing his money couldn't buy: his presence. Riverside Gardens bloomed with calculated perfection on Saturday afternoon, every flower bed manicured, every pathway swept clean, every detail designed to impress. White tents stretched across manicured lawns, their fabric rippling gently in spring breeze. Beneath them, tables draped in silk held champagne towers and delicacies most people couldn't pronounce. This was Gary D. Baker's stage, and today he needed to perform flawlessly. The Henderson merger depended on it. $300 million balanced on handshakes and carefully crafted charm. Robert Henderson stood near the fountain, gray-haired and skeptical, watching Gary with eyes that had seen too many corporate wolves dressed in sheep's clothing. He'd told Gary directly last week, "I don't do business with men who don't understand what matters. Show me who you really are." So Gary brought Erica. She stood beside him in a pale blue dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde hair pulled back with ribbons that matched perfectly. A living, breathing prop in his performance of successful fatherhood. He kept his hand on her shoulder, smiling at executives who passed by, accepting compliments about what a beautiful daughter he had, what a devoted father he must be. Erica's hands stayed pressed against her sides, fingers twitching with unspoken words. Her eyes darted around the crowd, overwhelmed by mouths moving in conversation she couldn't hear, laughter that existed only as vibrations she felt through her feet. Gary squeezed her shoulder when she shifted uncomfortably, a gentle warning to stay still, to smile, to play the part he needed her to play. "Your daughter is lovely," Henderson said, approaching with a champagne flute. "Does she enjoy these events?" "She loves them," Gary lied smoothly, his smile never wavering. "Don't you, sweetheart?" Erica looked up at her father, confusion in her eyes. She hadn't read his lips. She didn't know what he'd just said about her. Gary's smile tightened slightly, but he covered it well, launching into a story about how important family was to him, how everything he built was for her future. Henderson nodded, but something flickered in his expression. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of a performance he'd seen before. Beyond the white tents, near the garden's edge where manicured lawns gave way to wilder spaces, Oscar Hodge moved through shadows like a ghost. 11 years old, clothes torn and stained, hair wild from weeks without proper washing. He'd learned the patterns of wealthy gatherings, knew exactly when caterers threw away food that was still perfectly good, knew which security guards actually paid attention and which ones just stood around looking official. He crouched behind a service tent, watching staff scrape barely touched appetizers into trash bags. His stomach had been empty since yesterday. Hunger was an old companion, patient and persistent, always waiting. He'd eat soon, once the staff finished their shift change, once the attention turned elsewhere. But for now he watched. Watched the billionaire with his expensive suit and hollow smile. Watched the little girl in the blue dress, hands pressed tight against her sides, fear and loneliness radiating from her like heat. Watched the crowd of wealthy people pretending not to notice the disconnect between father and daughter, too polite or too indifferent to acknowledge the quiet tragedy playing out before them. Oscar had survived 3 years on the streets by reading what others missed. Body language, micro-expressions, the unspoken truths people tried to hide. And what he saw now, watching Gary D. Baker perform fatherhood for an audience, was a man drowning in success and a child slowly disappearing beside him. The performance continued. The champagne flowed. The deal inched closer. And nobody noticed the walls growing higher between the man and his daughter. Brick by brick, smile by smile, lie by lie. Nobody except the homeless boy watching from the shadows. The ancient oak tree had stood in Riverside Gardens for over 200 years, its massive branches stretching wide enough to shade half the lawn where Gary's guests mingled. Beneath its canopy, the networking continued, voices rising and falling in practiced corporate rhythms. Henderson stood directly under the largest branch, deep in conversation with 3 other executives, discussing market shares and quarterly projections. Erica wandered toward the tree's trunk, grateful for a moment away from her father's guiding hand. She pressed her palm against the rough bark, feeling its solidity, its age, its permanence in a world that always felt too uncertain. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with footsteps she couldn't hear, with laughter that existed only as tremors. Then she felt something else. A different vibration. Wrong. Her eyes traveled upward, following the massive branch that stretched above the gathered crowd. There, where it met the trunk, a dark line split the wood. Not old decay, but fresh damage. The crack ran deep, exposing pale wood beneath weathered bark. As she watched, a small piece of bark fell away, tumbling down through leaves before disappearing into the grass. Erica's breath caught. Her hands flew up, signing frantically. Danger. Tree. Break. Fall. Above. The words poured from her fingers with desperate urgency, her whole body shaking with the need to be understood. No one looked up. She ran toward the crowd, toward her father, hands still moving through the air, tears beginning to stream down her face. Her mouth opened in cries that felt like screaming inside her chest, sound she could feel but never hear. She grabbed Gary's sleeve, pulling hard, pointing upward, signing the same words over and over. Danger. Danger. Please. Look. Gary glanced down, irritation flashing across his face before he caught himself, remembering his audience. Erica, sweetheart, not now, he said, his voice low but firm. He couldn't see her hands moving, couldn't read the terror in her desperate gestures. He only saw disruption, embarrassment, his carefully constructed image beginning to crack. Looks like someone's getting tired, Henderson observed with a knowing smile. Just a little overwhelmed by all the excitement, Gary replied smoothly, kneeling down to Erica's level. We'll get ice cream soon, okay? Just give Daddy a few more minutes. Erica shook her head violently, tears falling faster now, her small hands forming shapes her father had never learned to read. The crowd began to notice, executives turning to watch with expressions ranging from pity to judgment. Spoiled thing, someone murmured behind jeweled fingers. Rich kids these days can't handle being told to wait. My daughter would never throw a tantrum like this in public. The whispers spread like ripples across water, each one adding weight to Gary's embarrassment. His jaw tightened. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. Look, I'll order you anything you want. New tablet. That doll you saw last week? Just please, Erica, calm down. But Erica wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were fixed upward, on the crack that was widening, on the branch that was shifting, on the danger that was seconds from becoming catastrophe. Her hands moved faster, more frantically, forming words in a language her father had been too busy to learn. She grabbed his arm with both hands, trying to pull him away from the tree, away from the crowd, away from the death that hung above them like a sword on fraying rope. But Gary gently removed her grip, his smile strained, his voice taking on an edge. That's enough, Erica. Around them, the crowd had fully turned now, watching the billionaire struggle with his difficult daughter. Some faces showed sympathy. Others showed satisfaction at seeing Gary D. Baker, the untouchable titan, brought low by a crying child he couldn't control. Henderson watched silently, his expression unreadable. Above them all, unseen by everyone except the terrified girl, the crack spread deeper into ancient wood. The branch groaned softly, a sound lost beneath conversation and judgment. Fibers began to split. Physics prepared for inevitability. And still, no one understood what Erica was trying to say. Her hands kept signing into empty air, forming words that fell like tears, unread, unheard, ignored. Danger. Please. Listen. Look up. Please. Oscar had learned to read the world the way other children read books. 3 years on the streets had taught him that survival depended on seeing what others missed, hearing what others ignored, understanding the language of danger before it spoke in violence. From his position behind the service tent, he watched the scene unfold beneath the oak tree with the focused intensity of a predator. Except Oscar wasn't hunting. He was simply trying to survive long enough to eat the catered food currently being scraped into trash bags 20 feet away. But something about the little girl in the blue dress made him pause. He'd seen plenty of rich kids throw tantrums. He'd watched them scream for toys, cry for attention, collapse on sidewalks when parents refused to buy them something expensive and useless. This wasn't that. The body language was all wrong. The girl's hands weren't flailing randomly. They were moving with purpose, forming shapes in the air, repeating patterns over and over. Her tears weren't the tears of frustration or anger. They were tears of terror, pure and absolute. Oscar had seen that kind of fear before, in the eyes of other street kids seconds before violence found them, in the faces of people who knew something bad was coming and couldn't make anyone listen. She wasn't having a tantrum. She was trying to communicate. Oscar's eyes narrowed as he studied her movements more carefully. Her hands kept pointing upward, then making sharp downward motions. Her whole body oriented toward the tree, toward something above the crowd. Whatever she was trying to say, it had everything to do with what was above them. He followed her gaze upward. For a moment, he saw nothing but leaves and branches against blue sky. Then his eyes adjusted, focused, locked onto the detail that everyone else had missed. The crack, deep and fresh, running through the largest branch like a lightning bolt frozen in wood. The branch that stretched directly over the gathered executives, over Henderson, over the billionaire father who was too embarrassed by his daughter to understand she was trying to save his life. Oscar's breath caught. He'd seen enough broken things to recognize structural failure. That branch weighed hundreds of pounds, maybe thousands, and it was holding on by fibers that were splitting even as he watched, even as the wind pushed gently against leaves that acted like sails, adding pressure to wood that couldn't take much more. The girl knew. Somehow she'd seen it first, and now she was desperately trying to warn everyone, using hands instead of voice, forming words in a language the crowd couldn't read. Sign language. The realization hit Oscar like cold water. He'd seen it before, learned bits and pieces from a deaf woman named Margaret who used to run a shelter on 5th Street before it closed down. She'd taught him basic signs during the winter he'd spent sleeping in her storage room, sneaking him food and warmth when no one else would. The girl was deaf, and she was signing danger over and over, her small hands screaming into silence while her father tried to bribe her quiet with promises of ice cream and tablets. Oscar's eyes darted between the cracks spreading deeper, the crowd gathering closer beneath the branch, and the girl whose warning was falling on ears that could hear but refused to listen. Above them, another small piece of bark fell away. The branch shifted slightly, settling lower by inches that would soon become feet, would soon become catastrophe. Time moved differently in moments like this. Oscar had felt it before, the way seconds stretched into strange elasticity right before something terrible happened. The moment before a fight broke out. The instant before a car jumped a curb. The breath before everything changed. He was living in that stretched second now, watching physics prepare to teach expensive lessons about gravity and mortality. The crowd laughed at something Henderson said. The girl's father checked his phone. Erica's hands kept forming words no one would read. And Oscar understood with perfect clarity that he had maybe 30 seconds before that branch came down and turned this garden party into a tragedy. 30 seconds to make them see what the deaf girl had been screaming about all along. He stepped out from behind the tent and started running. Oscar's worn sneakers hit manicured grass at full speed, his thin legs pumping harder than they ever had running from security guards or angry shop owners. But this time he wasn't running away from danger. He was running straight toward it. Move. His voice cracked with urgency, raw and desperate. The tree. Get away from the tree. Heads turned. Faces registered confusion, then annoyance. A homeless boy in torn clothes, sprinting across their elegant event, screaming about nothing they could see. Security guards stepped forward, hands reaching for radios. Gary's expression darkened with fresh embarrassment. This day was falling apart in ways he couldn't control. Oscar didn't slow down. His eyes locked on Erica, still standing at the tree's base, still signing frantically, still trying to warn a crowd that had already dismissed her. 20 feet away. 15. He could see the crack now, see how wide it had opened, see the branch beginning its final surrender to gravity. Everyone back, he screamed again, but the warning came too late. The branch gave way with a sound like a gunshot, wood fibers snapping all at once in a chorus of destruction. The crack echoed across Riverside Gardens, sharp enough to cut through conversation, loud enough to freeze champagne glasses halfway to lips. For one suspended heartbeat, everyone looked up. The massive limb dropped. Oscar reached Erica in the space between heartbeats, his arms wrapping around her small frame, his momentum carrying them both sideways in a tumbling roll across grass that suddenly felt too slow, too far, not fast enough to escape what was falling behind them. The branch hit the ground like a bomb. Earth shook. Air exploded with the percussion of impact. Tables collapsed under the weight of falling wood, champagne towers shattering in crystal cascades. The white tent poles snapped like kindling, fabric billowing down over screaming guests who scattered in every direction. Leaves and bark and splinters filled the air in a cloud of destruction, turning elegant afternoon into chaos within seconds. Oscar's shoulder hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his body, but he kept his arms wrapped around Erica, kept rolling, kept moving until they were clear of the debris field. Behind them, the branch settled into its new position across crushed tables and shattered elegance, its massive trunk covering exactly the spot where Erica had been standing, where she'd been crying, where she'd been trying to warn them all. The screaming started then. Real screaming, not the polite objections to a child's tantrum, but genuine terror as people realized how close they'd come to death. Executives stumbled away from the fallen branch, suits covered in leaves and dirt, hands shaking, faces pale with shock. Henderson stood frozen, staring at the space where he'd been standing 3 seconds ago, the space now occupied by tons of ancient oak. Gary D. Baker remained motionless, his phone still in his hand, his mind trying to process what had just happened. The branch. The homeless boy. Erica. The pieces wouldn't fit together properly in his brain, wouldn't form a picture that made sense. Then he saw them. Oscar and Erica, tangled together on the grass 20 feet away. Both breathing hard, both alive. The boy's arms still wrapped protectively around his daughter. Erica's face pressed against the stranger's torn shirt, her whole body shaking with sobs that came from relief rather than fear. Understanding hit Gary like a physical blow. The crying, the signing, the desperate pulling at his sleeve, the terror in her eyes that he'd mistaken for a tantrum. She'd seen the crack. She'd known the branch was falling. She'd been trying to save everyone, trying to warn them all, screaming in the only language she had. And he'd told her to be quiet. Had promised her ice cream if she'd just stop embarrassing him. Had chosen his business deal over her desperate warning. The homeless boy had understood what he couldn't. Had seen what he'd been too blind to notice. Had saved his daughter's life while Gary stood checking his phone. His legs moved without conscious thought, carrying him across torn grass toward where Oscar was slowly sitting up, helping Erica to her feet. The boy's shoulder hung at an odd angle, pain written across his young face, but his eyes stayed on Erica, making sure she was okay before worrying about himself. Gary dropped to his knees in front of them, his expensive suit staining with grass and dirt, his hands reaching for Erica but not quite knowing how to touch her, how to hold her, how to bridge the distance his negligence had created. "She was trying to tell you," Oscar said quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting. She saw it breaking. She was trying to save everyone. Gary's vision blurred. Around them, sirens approached in the distance. People shouted. Chaos continued. But in that moment, all he could see was his daughter's tear-stained face, and all he could feel was the crushing weight of understanding exactly how badly he'd failed her. Not just today. Every day. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the stunned silence that had settled over Riverside Gardens. They moved efficiently through the scattered crowd, checking vitals, treating cuts from flying glass, wrapping ice around twisted ankles from people who'd stumbled while running. Minor injuries, mostly. Miraculously, no one had been directly hit by the falling branch. Gary sat on the grass with Erica pulled close against his chest, his arms wrapped around her in a way that felt both foreign and desperately necessary. She was still shaking, her whole body trembling like a leaf, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with trauma that ran deeper than bruises. He'd held her before. Quick hugs before business trips. Posed embraces for charity event photographers. But this was different. This was the first time in years he'd actually felt her, truly registered the smallness of her frame, the rapid beating of her heart against his chest, the way her fingers gripped his jacket like she was afraid he'd disappear. For the first time in years, he really looked at her. Not at the problem she represented, not at the image she helped him project, but at Erica herself. Her face was pale beneath tear tracks. Her eyes held a kind of exhaustion that no 7-year-old should carry. And underneath the shock of the near-death experience, he saw something else. Something that had probably been there for years, waiting for him to notice. Loneliness. Deep and permanent. Carved into the foundation of who she was becoming. She hadn't just been traumatized by the falling branch. She'd been traumatized by not being understood, by screaming into silence, by knowing danger was coming and being powerless to make anyone listen. How many times had she felt this way? How many moments had she tried to communicate, tried to connect, tried to be heard, only to be met with his distracted smiles and expensive bribes? A paramedic approached, checked Erica over with gentle efficiency, declared her physically unharmed. Gary nodded his thanks, but couldn't form words. His throat had closed around shame too large to swallow. Across the scattered debris, he spotted Oscar trying to slip away toward the garden's edge, one arm cradled against his chest, his thin frame already fading back into the shadows where homeless boys belonged. Something in Gary's chest lurched. Wait. He stood quickly, settling Erica on the grass. Please wait. Oscar paused, turned slowly, eyes wary like a stray dog expecting to be kicked. Up close, Gary could see the boy was even younger than he'd thought. Maybe 11, maybe 12. Dirt streaked his face. His clothes hung loose on a frame that spoke of too many missed meals. You saved her, Gary said, his voice breaking. You saved us all. How did you? He stopped, struggling to find the right question among the hundreds crowding his mind. How did you know? What did you see that I missed? Oscar studied him for a long moment, those sharp eyes reading things Gary didn't know he was showing. When the boy finally spoke, his voice was quiet but each word landed like a stone. She was talking. You just weren't listening. The simplicity of it shattered something inside Gary. Not an accusation. Not judgment. Just truth, delivered without malice by a child who had nothing but still understood everything. She was signing, Oscar continued, gesturing with his good arm, telling everyone the branch was breaking, warning you, trying to save you. He paused, glanced at Erica sitting alone on the grass. She's been trying to talk to you for a long time, I think. You just don't speak her language. Gary's knees buckled. He sat down hard on the grass, his expensive suit ruined, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him like the broken branch. Every business success, every corporate victory, every million earned suddenly meant nothing in the face of this homeless boy's simple observation. He'd been deaf to his daughter's voice for years, and it took a stranger to hear what he'd refused to learn. Finding Oscar took 3 days of searching shelters, questioning street vendors, and walking through parts of the city Gary had never bothered to notice before. Parts where success was measured in finding a safe place to sleep, where wealth meant having enough to eat, where the billboards advertising his company's latest products loomed over people who could never afford them. He finally found the boy behind a dumpster near 5th Street, huddled in a cardboard shelter that wouldn't survive the next rain. Oscar's injured shoulder had been wrapped in dirty bandages, probably salvaged from somewhere, definitely not treated by a doctor. When he saw Gary approaching in his tailored coat, the boy's first instinct was to run. Please, Gary said, holding up empty hands. I just want to talk. Oscar stayed, but kept his distance, eyes watchful. Between them stretched the chasm of different worlds, different languages, different understandings of what mattered. "You know sign language," Gary began. "How?" The boy shrugged with his good shoulder. "Margaret. She ran a shelter on 5th before the city closed it down. She was deaf. Taught me some signs when I stayed there during winter. Said everyone should know at least a little, because you never know when you'll need to talk to someone who can't hear." Gary absorbed this. A homeless shelter worker had understood something he'd missed with all his resources, all his specialists, all his money. She'd known that communication was a bridge that required effort from both sides. "Will you teach me?" The words came out quieter than Gary intended, stripped of the authority he usually commanded. "Please. I'll pay you. Whatever you want. I just need to learn how to talk to my daughter." Oscar's expression shifted, something like pity crossing his young face. "I don't want your money. Then what do you want?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, studying Gary with those sharp, survival-honed eyes. "Nothing," he finally said. "I'll teach you because Erica deserves a father who can hear her. Not because you're paying me." The distinction landed like a punch. Gary nodded slowly, humbled by wisdom from a child who owned nothing. They started that afternoon, sitting on a bench in the same park where the branch had fallen. Gary canceled a board meeting worth millions. Sent his assistant scrambling to reschedule a merger discussion that had taken months to arrange. For the first time in his career, he put something ahead of business. Oscar's hands moved slowly, patiently, forming letters in the air. A, B, C. The alphabet Gary should have learned 7 years ago, when Erica was born into silence and needed a father willing to enter her world. Gary's fingers felt clumsy, corporate soft, unpracticed at anything except typing emails and signing contracts. He fumbled through the shapes, got them wrong, tried again. Oscar corrected him without judgment, just repeated the motions until Gary's hands began to remember. "It's not just about the signs," Oscar explained, his young voice carrying knowledge earned through necessity. "It's about watching, really watching. Deaf people see everything because they have to. You have to learn to see her, not just look at her." Gary's throat tightened. How many times had he looked at Erica without seeing her? How many desperate attempts at communication had he dismissed as behavioral problems? They practiced for hours. D, E, F. Gary's hands ached from unfamiliar positions. His mind struggled to process language through gesture instead of sound. But he didn't stop. Didn't check his phone when it buzzed with urgent messages. Didn't glance at his watch when the afternoon stretched into evening. "Why are you helping me?" Gary asked finally, as the sun began to set. "After everything. After I ignored my own daughter while you, a stranger, saved her life. Why?" Oscar looked toward the oak tree, still lying where it had fallen, waiting for the city to remove it. "Because I know what it's like when nobody hears you," he said quietly. "When you're screaming and the whole world just walks past like you don't exist. Erica shouldn't have to feel that way from her own father." The simple honesty of it broke something loose in Gary's chest. Tears he'd been holding back for 3 days finally fell, and he didn't bother hiding them. A homeless 11-year-old had become his teacher, his mirror, his conscience. And the first lesson wasn't just about handshapes. It was about humility, about admitting he'd been wrong for 7 years, about learning that real strength wasn't in building empires, but in the courage to say, "I don't know how to do this. Please teach me." Gary came home that evening with hands that remembered letters and a heart that remembered how to feel ashamed. The mansion loomed before him as it always had, all 16 rooms glowing with expensive emptiness, but for the first time he saw it the way Erica must see it. Not as luxury, as loneliness. She was in her room, sitting by the window as usual, watching the world beyond glass she couldn't break through. The French tutor had left for the day. The speech therapist had given up hours ago. The nanny scrolled through her phone on the far side of the room, counting minutes until her shift ended. Gary dismissed them all with a wave. They left quickly, relieved, and suddenly it was just him and his daughter in a silence that had always existed but he'd never truly noticed before. He sat down on the floor beside her. Erica glanced at him, surprised. Her father didn't sit on floors, didn't wrinkle his suits, didn't exist at her level. Gary's hands trembled as he raised them, forming the shape Oscar had taught him that afternoon. Clumsy, uncertain, but unmistakable. Hello. Erica's eyes went wide. She stared at his hands like they were performing magic, like the impossible had just broken through into reality. Her mouth opened slightly, breath catching. Gary tried again, fingers shaking through the letters. I-L-O-V-Y-O-U. He got the last letter wrong. His pinky bent at the wrong angle, the shape not quite right. But it didn't matter. Erica's face crumpled, and she launched herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him over. Her small body shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been locked away for 7 years waiting for this moment. Gary held her, his own tears falling into her hair, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. All the specialists he'd hired, all the devices he'd bought, all the money he'd spent trying to fix what was never broken. And all she'd needed was this. His hands. His effort. His willingness to meet her in her world instead of demanding she adapt to his. When she pulled back, her hands moved rapidly, signing words he didn't understand yet. Too fast, too complex. But her face glowed with something he hadn't seen in years. Joy. Pure and unfiltered. He signed back slowly. Teachme. And she did. Right there on the bedroom floor, Erica became his teacher, showing him signs with patience he didn't deserve, correcting his mistakes with giggles that sounded like music he'd forgotten existed. Real laughter. Not the polite sound she made for cameras, but genuine, unguarded happiness. They practiced until her bedtime, and Gary tucked her in himself for the first time in months. As he turned to leave, her hand caught his sleeve. She signed something simple, something even his beginner's knowledge could translate. STY. So he did. Pulled a chair beside her bed and stayed until she fell asleep, her small hand wrapped around his finger, afraid he might disappear if she let go. The next morning, Gary called Oscar. "Move in with us," he said without preamble. "You need a home. We need you. Erica needs someone who understands her, and I need someone to teach me. Please." Oscar was quiet for a long moment. "I don't belong in places like that." "Neither did I once," Gary replied. "I built it with money but forgot to build a home. Help me fix that." Oscar arrived that afternoon with everything he owned in a plastic grocery bag. Gary showed him to a guest room that was larger than most apartments, with its own bathroom and a bed that didn't involve cardboard. The boy stood in the doorway, afraid to enter, afraid this was temporary, afraid it would disappear like every good thing in his life eventually did. "It's yours," Gary said gently, "for as long as you want it." That evening, the three of them sat at the dining table that had never been used for actual family dinners. Oscar taught them both new signs. Erica's hands flew with excitement, showing Oscar everything she'd tried to tell her father over the years. Gary struggled to keep up, but he tried. That was the difference now. He tried. The mansion's acoustics changed that night. Laughter echoed off marble floors. Footsteps carried purpose instead of loneliness. The cold walls that had separated them for so long began to warm with something money had never been able to buy. Presence. Connection. The simple miracle of being seen. Gary looked around his dining room, at the homeless boy teaching him words, at his daughter glowing with happiness, at the home they were building from broken pieces. And he understood, finally, what Henderson had been looking for when he'd asked to see who Gary really was. Not the billionaire. Not the empire builder. Just a father learning to listen. 6 months after the branch fell, Gary D. Baker sat in his home office signing business contracts while simultaneously conversing in ASL with his daughter. The multitasking would have seemed impossible to the man he'd been before Riverside Gardens, but that man had been living in a smaller world, limited by the assumption that only one kind of language mattered. The company had survived his transformation. Barely. The board had threatened mutiny when he'd restructured his schedule, when he'd started leaving at 5 o'clock, when he'd turned down acquisitions that would require extensive travel. Henderson, surprisingly, had been his strongest ally. "I invested in the man I saw sitting in the grass with his daughter," he'd said during one heated board meeting. Not the one who was too busy checking his phone to notice a tree falling on his head. The merger had gone through, but on Gary's terms. Terms that included time. Real time, not the leftover minutes between conference calls. Oscar had enrolled in school for the first time in 4 years. Gary had hired tutors not to fix anything, but to help the boy catch up on everything the streets had stolen from him. Oscar's room had slowly filled with books, clothes that fit, belongings that weren't carried in plastic bags. But the most important thing he'd gained wasn't material. It was permanence. The understanding that this wasn't temporary, that he didn't have to keep one foot ready to run. The three of them had become something Gary had never planned for but desperately needed. Not a traditional family, but a family nonetheless, built on the foundation of shared language, mutual respect, and the understanding that love required effort, not just intention. Evenings settled over the mansion as Gary finished the last contract. He found Erica and Oscar in the kitchen, working together on dinner. Oscar had taught her to cook simple meals, another language they shared. Gary joined them, his hands moving through conversation while his heart settled into the comfortable rhythm of belonging. They ate together at the table that now bore the marks of actual use. Scratches from dropped utensils. Water rings from forgotten glasses. Evidence of life being lived rather than staged. The conversation flowed in signs and laughter, in the comfortable pauses that only exist between people who don't need to fill every silence with noise. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Oscar sprawled on the couch with a book for school. Erica curled up beside her father, her head resting against his shoulder in the casual intimacy they'd built one sign at a time. Gary's phone buzzed with an urgent email from Tokyo. 6 months ago he would have answered immediately. Now he glanced at it and set it aside. Whatever it was could wait until morning. The world would keep spinning. Deals would keep happening. But this moment, this quiet evening with his daughter and the boy who'd saved them both, this was happening right now and would never come again. Erica's hands moved in his peripheral vision. He turned to face her fully, giving her his complete attention. The gift he'd learned was more valuable than anything he could buy. Her signs came slowly, deliberately, weighted with meaning. "You understand me now." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a recognition of change, an acknowledgement of the distance traveled from that afternoon in the garden when her screams had fallen on deaf ears. Gary's throat tightened. His hands rose, forming words that came from the deepest part of who he'd become. "I'm sorry it took me so long to learn how to listen." Erica smiled, not the polite smile she'd worn for cameras, but the real one that crinkled her eyes and showed the gap where she'd lost a tooth last month. She signed back, quick and simple. "You're listening now. That's what matters." Gary pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Across the room, Oscar looked up from his book, caught Gary's eye, and offered a small nod. No words needed. No signs required. Just understanding passing between two people who'd learned that the loudest truths often lived in silence. The mansion settled around them, warm now where it had once been cold, full where it had once been empty. Outside, the city continued its endless noise, millions of people talking, shouting, broadcasting their existence to anyone who would listen. But inside, 3 people sat in comfortable quiet, speaking volumes in the spaces between signs, in the shared meals and casual touches, in the simple presence that had once seemed impossible. Gary had spent his whole life building an empire of noise. Conference calls and board meetings and deals closed with handshakes and words. He'd measured success in quarterly reports and stock prices and the volume of applause at shareholder meetings. But he'd learned something in the months since Oscar pulled his daughter from beneath a falling branch. He'd learned that the most important conversations happen in silence. That understanding doesn't require sound. That love speaks loudest when it stops trying to be heard and starts learning to listen. The evening stretched on. Oscar returned to his book. Erica dozed against her father's shoulder. Gary sat very still, afraid to disturb the peace, afraid to break the spell of this ordinary miracle. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it completely, because he'd finally learned what mattered. Not the deals he could close or the money he could make or the empire he could build. Just this. This quiet room. This borrowed son reading by lamplight. This daughter sleeping against his heart. This family built from broken pieces and second chances. This silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Glad you like it. Please subscribe to this channel for more intriguing and amazing story like this. Thank you.